In this talk, I'm once again asking the question, did God create everything? And I'm looking at something called spontaneous generation. And that's the theory that living things, like human beings, can be made from non-living matter. Now, for that to happen, we need something fundamental called amino acids. So let's see how evolutionary theory suggests that amino acids were made. Every living thing is made of things called proteins. Now these are very long, complex molecules, but they're made up of about 20 much simpler molecules called amino acids. Best way to think about it is look at the picture there. You might have a very large, complicated, fancy house, like the one shown in the picture, but it's made of bricks. And in the same way, proteins are made of amino acids. So where did the amino acids come from? In the 1920s, a famous Russian biochemist called Alexander Oparin made a hypothesis, and he suggested that the atmosphere of the primeval Earth was composed essentially of certain gases, methane, ammonia, hydrogen and water vapour, and that life had arisen as a result of chemical reactions occurring between this atmosphere and the chemicals found in the Earth with the aid of ultraviolet radiation from the sun and other naturally occurring sources of energy such as lightning. In 1953, a 23-year-old graduate student conducted a very famous experiment. His name was Stanley Miller. He was working with somebody called Miller-Urey, and he conducted an experiment to test Oparin's hypothesis. He did a laboratory experiment where he passed electrical discharges through a mixture of water vapour, ammonia, methane and hydrogen, as suggested by Oparin. After 2 days, Miller had found 2% yield of amino acids. So he'd found some amino acids in his experiment, and further experiments since then have produced all but one of the 20 amino acids necessary for life. The theory goes that these amino acids were washed into the world's oceans in prehistoric Earth and formed what's called a primordial soup, and this seems to have been incredibly successful. So under the conditions thought to exist in the Earth, then amino acids have been made. And if there's enough of them in a concentrated soup, then life can start. Proteins can be made and we can have life. You can imagine that the results of this experiment were greeted with euphoria because finally evolutionary biologists have solved the problem of life. We now can make, from non-living things, we can make amino acids, and those amino acids can turn into proteins and eventually life. So the origin of life, we've done it. Bingo. The Miller-Urey experiment is still quoted as a suitable explanation for the start of life. But Miller did his experiment nearly 70 years ago, and since then, things have gone seriously wrong. So here's 3 things where the theory is no longer thought to be credible. Geochemists now believe the original atmosphere was nothing like the one that Miller was using or that Oparin suggested. In fact, the original atmosphere didn't promote life, but was actually hostile to life. There's one problem. There's another problem. The amino acids that were made, there's a left-hand and right-hand version of them. But in most proteins, almost all amino acids are left-hand versions. Now then, if I had a protein molecule with 100 amino acids in, what are the chances of getting just left-hand versions? Well, the chances are 1/2, a half to the power 100. That's about 1 chance in 10 to the power 30. And it's the same problem joining these amino acids together. They're called peptide links. I would call them amide bonds as chemists, but never mind. Peptide links, again, the chance of having a peptide link as opposed to a different type of bond is less than half. So once again, if I had a protein 100 amino acids long, what are the chances of making it? A half to the power 100 or 1 in 10 to the power 30? You can see it's very, very unlikely. But that's only the start of the problem. In this slide, we move away from theory and into what's called a law of science. So there's no contradictory evidence. The second law of thermodynamics is all to do with entropy or disorder. And basically what it says is that things tend to get more chaotic, more disordered, rather than more ordered. And we can see that in everyday life. The problem is the size of that primordial soup. And you can see there, This is a quote by Paul Davies, that to have a primordial soup big enough to create even simple single polypeptides or protein molecules, what size primordial soup would we need? Well, he tells you there, about the size of the observable universe. In other words, the chances are so slim that we need something the size of the universe even to create a single polypeptide molecules. Now, for most scientists, they understand the second law of thermodynamics and they know it works. And what that is saying is that there is no way that this theory can work. Most honest scientists who've actually looked into this would say that the chance of getting amino acids under the conditions in the original Earth's atmosphere is zero. They can't do it. We cannot generate amino acids. But laying that aside, even if we could, which we can't, what are the chances of those amino acids forming proteins and eventually forming life? Well, again, I mentioned this in a previous talk, but just to summarise, there's two quotes there. One from Fred Hoyle, famous, again, Nobel Prize winner. And he says the chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way through this primordial soup is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials. In other words, you start with a junkyard where there's nothing. Somehow, by completely random chance, you make a jumbo jet. Doesn't sound likely. And there's another one there by Hubert Yockey, who worked with Robert Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project to make the first atomic bomb. And he says the origin of life by chance in a primordial soup is impossible. In terms of probability, it can't happen. Once again, just to remind you, neither of these scientists are Christians or were Christians. They were atheists. But they can see this just doesn't work. Some so-called scientists believe in these theories, even though the evidence contradicts them, even though science says these are not valid theories. In fact, they're not even theories because there's no evidence to support them. Yet these scientists, evolutionary scientists, are desperate to believe them. And it reminded me of Isaiah 29, and there's a quote there, because really what they're saying to God is, you didn't make me. You know nothing. Pretty dangerous. What about you? Is that what you're saying to God? You don't know anything. You didn't make me. Well, maybe. Look at Romans 1. It says, have a look around you. The evidence is there. People are without excuse. You might think, okay, well, I'm not sure about these theories, but I definitely don't believe in God. Here's a question to finish. How did you get here?